Epic story of the railways, we've met many outstanding men and their pioneering machines. But many believe the man who contributed more than most has been largely eclipsed by the Stephensons. We've already met Timothy Hackworth at Wylam, but now Hackworth and the Stephensons were to find themselves at loggerheads. And it was this funny little engine called sans pareil, or without parallel, that was largely to blame.
One commentator wrote in 1830, Hackworth is improving the locomotive as no other man is doing, and is in advance of Stephenson. Hardly any two of Hackworth's locomotives are alike. Stephenson, while getting hold of a good idea, repeats it over again.
Jane, does that summarise your great-great-grandfather?
Yes, it does. He had gained so much experience in mechanical engineering, different modes of doing things from the time that he lived at Wylam until he settled here at Soho House in Shildon. And we're actually sitting in his parlour now.
Must be quite interesting for you to sit where he sat all those years ago.
Yes, it is. And he had a very good life here with his family. He was very much a family man, and that was very important to him.
You spent years researching the family history. The man himself must have emerged from your work.
He's a very compassionate man, and he loved family life. He became a Methodist in 1814 at Wylam, and in fact refused to work on a Sunday, and because of that had to leave Wylam. And in a way, that is why we are sitting here, because if he had stayed at Wylam all his life, history would have been very different.
So it kind of propelled him into a new phase of life?
It did, because he went from there to Walbottle and worked on stationary engines, and then, of course, was asked by George Stephenson to go and work at the Forth Street Works in 1824 when locomotion was being built. And subsequently, the directors of the Stockton and Darlington Railway asked him to come to Shildon.
So do you think that he and Stephenson were friends, or was it more of a working relationship, sort of at arm's length?
They'd known each other since they were small boys. They had both come from Wylam, and certainly when the Puffing Billies and Wylam Dillies were being built, and Hackworth was of course foreman of the Smiths, George Stephenson often went round to see what was happening there. I think that they rubbed along quite well, but I think perhaps Hackworth had reservations about George Stephenson, and perhaps that is why when he was first asked to come as superintendent engineer of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, he actually prevaricated. It took some persuasion, and he was offered a house, this house in which we are sitting, and £150 a year. But he did prevail upon the directors to allow him to also build locomotives in his own right, which he did here.
You must feel a bit aggrieved that Stephenson got all the credit.
Well, when I was a child, we used to be very angry, my father and I, who was also an engineer, about that he hadn't received the credit he deserved. But things have changed amazingly. More and more people are going back to original documents, and then looking more and more at what each one of the pioneers did to contribute to the railway system. But Hackworth probably introduced more innovations in the early steam locomotives than anyone else. He would get one and something wouldn't quite work, so he would try something else. It might be the plugs, it might be the springs, it might be the cylinders. He tried everything, and gradually something evolved which was really workable. And of course he built in 1827 the Royal George, which was probably the most important real early locomotive.
In what way? Why is she so important?
The Royal George was very important because at that time, in 1827, the directors of the Stockton and Darlington Railway were considering going back to the use of horses only, because the 4 Stephenson locomotives kept breaking down and were very costly. So Hackworth said, give me the chance to build a locomotive that will prove once and for all the supremacy of steam power over horsepower. And he built the Royal George, and actually could pull weights at half the cost of using horses. and steam locomotion was there forever.
Built in 1827, Royal George the locomotive summed up Hackworth the man. It was reliable, it was more than capable of doing the job for which it was constructed, and it was a big improvement on its contemporaries.
Well, now this building is very special in every way because it was Timothy's own baby, wasn't it?
Yes, this was one part of his own Soho works. He started to build up his Soho works while still running the Stockton-Darlington works during the day. But he wanted to build locomotives in his own right, and in 1836 he was asked by the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, to build a locomotive for Russia. It was a locomotive to pull the first passenger train in Russia, and it was a really very exciting time for him.
That means his reputation had spread beyond Chiltern and beyond England. He must have been a well-known man by then.
Yes, in fact, the Tsar's sons came over to Wylam in the very early days and were looking then at what was being done in England. And I think it's through that Hackworth got an order. The Stephensons also got an order, but Hackworth's locomotive was the first in Russia.
Hackworth's business card hints at his successes in the 1830s, but it hadn't always been so. In the 1820s, many were simply not convinced that locomotives were the future. Engineering was in its infancy, and breakdowns were commonplace. In 1829, the directors of Britain's first intercity passenger line between Liverpool and Manchester decided to hold a competition to find the most reliable and efficient locomotive. First prize, £500. The Rainhill Trials on October the 6th, 1829 have gone down in the annals as one of the greatest events in railway history. 10 engines were entered, 5 turned up, 2 withdrew, leaving Robert Stephenson's Rocket, the favourite Novelty, and Timothy Hackworth's Sans-Pareil, which incredibly he designed and built in his spare time.
He had to do the work wherever he could, probably in the house. Poor Mrs. Hackworth, I'm sure she had something to say about it. And he had to contract out for various parts of the locomotive to be built. It's quite interesting, actually, if you look at the Sans-Pareil, because it's only a 4-wheel locomotive, while the Royal George, which was 2 years before, was 6 wheels. So, you know, he could only do it in a sort of kind of limited way. But he built it, and he had various parts made at the Stephenson Works at 4th Street, Newcastle. And once again, it's the old story of these dratted cylinders. Because, first of all, George Stephenson had really laid down the rules for the competition for Liverpool-Manchester Railway. And when the Sans-Pareil arrived for the trials, it was decreed to be too heavy. Well, you know, I think the rules were changed rather to suit the Stephenson camp. But it was allowed to steam, and in one of the trials, the cylinder blew. It, in fact, achieved faster speed originally than the Rocket. And also, after the trials, the Rocket only ran for a year or so, while the original Sans-Pareil went on first as a locomotive and then was converted to a stationary engine and went on working until 1864.
So do you smell a rat? Do you think there was conspiracy against her?
There's always been the great thing. I actually don't think there probably was. I do think it was an inexact science. I do think that Stephenson was pretty determined for the Rocket to really do well. But I think the actual case of the cylinder was just, it was such a difficult job. And you know, the Russian story, it's a few years later and the same problem arose, and it arose on a lot of the early locomotives.
Now, I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. At Rainhill, comparing Hackworth and Stephenson, who was the worthy winner?
It's quite interesting, actually, because I'm going to be a little more controversial than that, because actually George Stephenson didn't build the Rocket, it was his son Robert Stephenson, which I think is very important, Robert Stephenson and Co., with Booth, who actually had quite a lot to do with the boiler. But I think probably the Rocket actually was too light for the job and didn't run successfully afterwards, while the Sans-Pareil did run successfully afterwards. And I think we have to leave it therefore to other people to say which was the most successful locomotive.
Well, you tell me.
Well,
Was
proof
this
of
the better
pudding-
locomotive?
The proof of the pudding is in the eating. And this locomotive ran for many, many years, while the Rocket did not.
Well, as every schoolboy knows, the winner at Rainhill was the Rocket. But was she a worthy winner? Well, by happy coincidence, she's at the National Railway Museum in York, undergoing a thorough examination.
First of all, that is 13.
Well, Michael, this is what's left of the old girl herself. What are you doing to her?
Well, we're trying to find out rather more about Rocket than has hitherto been understood. We're looking at the locomotive in minute detail, trying to establish what modifications were made during her working life, and indeed what modifications were made during her time at the Science Museum.
Well, was she a worthy winner at Rainhill then?
Oh, very much so. Rocket was one of a series of prototype locomotives which Robert Stephenson and his team at Newcastle developed specifically for mainline service on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. They had managed to develop the locomotive to this point by the time of the Rainhill trials. But of course there was a lot more development to take place even after Rocket, and she was pretty well out of date straight away because they learned so much as a result of Rainhill itself.
But of course she became, and still is, the most famous locomotive in the world.
Yes, indeed she is, that's right. And quite rightly so, of course, because she represents so much of the specific endeavours of Robert Stephenson and his team to create a locomotive worthy of mainline operation.
The National Railway Museum here in York is home to this great locomotive. She's the last steam engine ever built by British Rail in 1960. It's a testament to Stephenson that the techniques he used to build Rocket were used in the construction of the Evening Star 131 years later.